Hi all. So we're going to get started with today's webinar. There may be a few people joining us as we go along, and that's absolutely fine. Firstly, I just wanted to say a big welcome, really, and thank you for joining us for today's NPMS webinar. We're going to be covering today locating and recording on linear plots within your survey squares. The first thing to say really is just please be aware that because this is a webinar, I can't actually see you or hear you. So if you'd like to ask a question or raise any points, which we very much encourage, please just use the Q&A function, which for myself is located along the bottom Zoom bar there. But I think some people have them at the top. But it's basically a button that's got a big Q&A in there. So if you've got any questions there. Also, please do feel free to use the chat box. Again, if you have any points that you'd like to raise, or if you're having any difficulty hearing or seeing me, I'm going to go ahead and assume that everybody can hear me fine and they can see the screen I'm sharing there. Please do just pop something in the chat bar. If not, and it's also worth mentioning that you should have an option towards the top of your Zoom bar. There's, I think it's 9 little squares button, and it's to change your view. So you have options there to how you'd like to view the screen today. If you want to make it bigger, for example, you can choose to have a full screen. Because I'm afraid I can't see you or hear you, it can be a little bit difficult to monitor these Q&A boxes and the chat boxes. So just on time, I can see there, Sarah's just popped a little note there into the chat box to say we do have Sarah. So Sarah Shopworth is here with me today, and she'll be monitoring the chat and the Q&A today. So please do feel free to get in there and to write any questions, and Sarah will be doing her best. She'll be going through and responding to these as we go, or anything that occurs to you as we go. And she'll also just be raising any of these that potentially could be really useful for the group to discuss further towards the end, and there should be plenty of opportunity to ask any questions at the end as well. That's the added bonus really of these live sessions, being able to answer any questions and queries as they occur to you. But it is also worth noting that this session will be recorded and it'll be added to our NPMS YouTube channel. So it'll be available to go back to and refer to if you miss anything, or if you just want to refresh later. And hopefully this also means that you can sit back and relax a little bit now, perhaps with a cup of tea, and not worry too much if you forget anything or you want to check back later. So just to give you an outline of what we're hoping to cover here today, I'll just briefly introduce the basics of linear plots, which we do ask, if possible, to include 2 of these within your NPMS survey monad or your survey square. I'll provide a little bit more guidance on how to go about setting up these linear plots, so how to locate them and record where they are within your square, as well as popping that information online for the NPMS database. And then we'll get on to laying out and recording on linear plots in the different NPMS habitat types for which these linear plots are applicable. So I've just listed them there on this slide. You can see arable field margins, hedgerows, road verges, standing waters, rivers, streams, and such, and also rock outcrops, cliff bases, or screes. So to get started then, thinking about the basics of linear plots, as I've said, NPMS survey guidance and methodology asks that if possible, if you have appropriate habitat to do so, when you visit your kilometre square, try to select 2 linear plots that are accessible to survey. So unlike the square 5 by 5 metre plots, linear plots will measure usually 1 metre by 25 metres, but they don't need to be rectangular, and your plot may not be a straight line. We are talking about nature after all. It may follow a winding feature, such as the edge of a body of water. I'll describe that a little bit more shortly. We use 2 markers to establish the 1 metre width, and then using our cord or our tape measure, we measure out 25 metre in length. And for linear plots, where you measure your 1 metre width varies depending on the habitat that you're actually recording in. And indeed, in some cases, these dimensions may actually vary as well. So as I say, I'll go into these, each of these a bit more shortly when we talk about the different habitats. But it's a good opportunity actually to highlight your current guidance that we already have available on laying out your plots, both square and linear, on the NPMS online training page of the website. And also this fab video by Sarah produced last year and popped on the NPMS YouTube channel, because it really has some great tips on things like marking out your plots, getting those right angles and what kit to use. So that's incredibly helpful for general plot setup tips. So thinking about selecting where to place your linear plots, the square habitat maps that we provide to each of our volunteers looks a little something like this, with those pre-selected number plot locations randomized. And if possible, we do say that it's recommended that you use these number plot locations as a starting point, really, to start looking for places that you can put these plots. And that's to avoid selection bias, basically. As you can imagine, if we were always able to choose our exact plot locations, we may very well end up choosing the rather exciting, lovely patch that may not be a true representation of what's really happening nationally or in these habitats. In the self-guidance notes, you'll also see there's protocol A regarding self-selecting plots. And this can be done if there are reasons why you cannot use those recommended number plots due to factors like safety, access, or simply there's no appropriate NPMS habitat for linear features near or on these plot locations. Ideally, for linear plots, you want them to cover part of the feature that intersects with an internal boundary or a grid line, like the ones you can see there on the map. And that's really for ease of recording and to help you relocate those plots when you come back to survey on subsequent visits. Your plot should ideally start at the point where the feature does intersect with that grid line, and then really in any direction from there. A tip that we would say is that aerial photographs can be particularly useful when you're thinking about going to visit your square and what areas and what sections of your square may have suitable habitats for these plots. And these aerial photographs can be a lot more useful than, say, our OS map or our habitat map for things that you can't see on these maps. I'm thinking of things like hedgerows or arable field margins. So I've just popped here some examples of websites that you can search for, and you can view aerial images online. So there's good old Google Maps. You can also search and use getamap.com, I believe it is. UK Grid Reference Finder can be really helpful, as well as Grab a Grid Reference. And all these can really help to build a picture of your plot and where there may be something suitable before you then go and have a proper look out on the ground. Here I've included an example of where we have looked to find a linear plot, and you can see how we've placed it along this habitat map. Looking at the map just there in the top right hand corner, we can see our recommended plots and the grid lines. And it does, if you have a little look, appear to be a linear feature intersecting with an internal grid line. It's just below point 22 there. And a recce of this area has shown that there is indeed a field border, and happily with a suitable hedgerow to survey. And a plot has therefore been placed along this feature, intersecting with that grid line. So this will then ease relocation for future surveys. But as I say, should no linear features intersect grid lines within your square, if you're not lucky enough, you'll just need to apply protocol A, which is on page 10 of the guidance notes, and just self-select a plot that has a suitable linear feature. I can see that 2 participants have got their hands raised. So if that's a wave, hello. Otherwise, please do feel free to pop those questions in the Q&A box or the chat box. Thanks. So out in the field, you are setting up your linear plot for the first time. You use your 25-meter cord or tape measure, and you mark the length of the plot. We suggest you use markers, 2 markers at either end to establish that 1 meter width of the plot. Something I tend to recommend is to mark your 25-meter length piece of rope at 5-meter intervals. This helps break up the plot a little as you're going along and surveying, but it also provides a really handy reminder as you're going along setting up your plot to just double check that 1 meter width. So making sure that you are keeping 1 meter as you go along. If you have a GPS device, or a handy phone app, you can use it to record the position of both ends of the plot to enter on your recording form, rather than just that one corner as we do for square plots. There's also the opportunity, of course, to take photographs from outside the plot, showing its surroundings. And this can then be uploaded onto the NPMS website. This will help to relocate your plot in the future years, but it also helps to show changes over time. So that's really useful. As with all plot types, we do recommend you make a sketch of the plot in the space provided on your survey form. And note that in some instances, the linear habitat in which you are surveying may be shorter actually in length than the length of your linear plot. So in these instances, we do ask that you record the complete length of the linear feature. And you just really need to note the length that you have surveyed, so the length of that feature that you have surveyed, and note that on your recording form, but also when you enter the data later. But I'll just be coming on to some examples of that again shortly. And as I said, of course, we are talking about nature here. So unless you have an extremely neat hedgerow or a poker straight arable field margin, for example, natural features are really super straight, and that's absolutely fine. Your plot doesn't need to be a straight line or a rectangle. It may well follow a winding feature, such as a body of water, or a more realistic side of an arable field. And basically, you simply follow along the feature for the full 25 meters, and just ensuring that you're maintaining that width of 1 meter, following along the length of that feature. Also, as I've said, and shown just in this example here in this little diagram, the linear habitat may well be shorter than the length of the linear plot. Ideally, of course, we'd like a 25-meter plot, but sometimes that's just not possible. So again, record the complete length of the linear feature and note the length that you've surveyed. You'll then be able to create your plot online in just the same way as you do your square plots, by heading to Create Plots and Enter Data, and then View Squares and Create Plots on the NPMS website. You choose the option to create or draw a plot, and then you use the option to select a linear plot type. So this is where we're entering a linear plot into the NPMS database to then associate your recordings with. Once you've found your linear plot location on the map, you just select it in exactly the same way. And the reason that I just wanted to highlight this is it is slightly different online, because once you've clicked on your plot selection icon, you can click the center of your chosen plot to generate the grid reference, or in fact, more accurately, it would be helpful to enter the 2 plot end grid references that you recorded earlier. But I'd also really strongly suggest ticking the box to activate expert mode, which I've just shown in the arrow here on the left-hand side. And the reason for that being, basically, if you just have the grid references, it's automatically going to have a straight line, essentially, from the 2 different grid references that you've entered, which may not be the case if you have got a winding feature, for example. So by selecting expert mode, that gives you the option. I'm going to see if this works. Yep, I've got a little arrow there to select the line drawing option. And this adds an additional tool, which basically means that you can click along your feature to draw the line. So once that lines tool is selected, as I say, you manually click along the feature to draw your line, and you double click at the end. And that just gives you a more accurate view for yourself. It gives you a much better visual of the plot that you're going to be surveying, and that you can go and look at again when it's time to revisit your plot, but also that the data and the information that we have regarding where you've surveyed is more accurate. So that really was just a quick indication of how to create these plots on our website. But for further help while you are creating your plots, or if you want to actually see it in action, that can help sometimes, I'd really recommend our web orientation and data entry video on the YouTube channel. Or if, like me, you like to go at your own speed, we actually have a click-by-click document on plot creation on the online training page of the NPMS website. I don't want to spend a huge amount of time doing that today, but there's some really great resources already out there to help. So that was a brief overview of our linear plots, because now I really plan to go into a little bit more detail. about how we set these up in the different habitats, because it does vary. So we can see here the different habitat types for which we use linear plots. We have arable field margins, hedgerows, road verges. While not an NPMS habitat per se, they can contain NPMS target habitat. We also have bodies of water, so standing waters, rivers, streams, ponds and canals. And lastly, we've got rocky outcrops, cliffs and screes. So as I've said, for linear plots, where you place your plots and also where you measure your 1 metre width does vary depending on which habitat you're recording in. And indeed, actually, in some cases, these dimensions may vary also, and how you lay your plot and how you record along it. So we're just going to go through these now, one at a time. So first, thinking about our arable field margins. If your 1 kilometre survey square contains these as an option for a linear plot, our arable field margins are the areas alongside and following the edge of land cultivated to grow a variety of short-term crops, such as cereals, oilseed, rape and root crops like potatoes, for example. I would say fields that are being used to produce perennial crops of fruit or biofuel crops. So I'm thinking about strawberries, grapes, willow, elephant grass and so on. These should not be included when initially setting up plots. So don't include these arable margins. You may notice that there is a change in your field margin over time. Like many of our habitats, we do ask that you continue to record on your plot, noting any change in the comments section provided on your recording forms, but do continue to record, because that's really important information, knowing how these plots are changing and possible reasons why. So for example, if you enter a management type that you've witnessed or that you know of, that's really helpful. And it may well be the case that this plot will come back to how it was when you first started, but certainly continuing to record on these plots is really important. We're really interested in finding out about change over time. So linear plots on arable field margins should extend 1 metre from the edge of the cultivated area actually into the crop. So as you can see from the diagram here, and my rather crude sort of diagram there, as you can see, where fields with annually cultivated crops, as I say, have permanent strips sort of sown with grasses or pollinator or perhaps wildflower mixtures, the plots don't actually lay within that permanent strip, which is actually quite a common misconception, but rather it should be placed on the boundary between the permanent strip and the crop, and it should extend 1 metre actually into the cultivated area. So I've also just popped this little image here, actually to remind myself to let you know again that if you do have arable field margins that you are surveying or plan to survey with the scheme, now that you know where to place those plots and you're ready to get going, there's actually a really lovely, helpful guidance video for this habitat, including species ID, on the NPMS YouTube channel. Next, going along, we have hedgerows of native species, and this includes all hedgerows made up of 1 or more native trees or shrubs, so such as ash, blackthorn, elder, hawthorn, hazel, and so on. Ancient hedgerows are often the most species rich. They often have more than, say, 5 native trees or shrub species per your 25 metre plot length, but actually hedgerows with fewer species, including those that have been recently planted with native species, should also be recorded, as long as it has 1 or more of these native species. And knowing that it's been recently planted can be really useful, and that's great extra information to provide when you're recording on your plots. If possible, we ask that you record a 25 metre by 1 metre plot that is 1 metre out from the centre of the hedge. If the width of the hedge doesn't allow for this, so for example, if it's an exceptionally wide hedge, or if the shrub component is much wider, that makes it quite tricky, then we just ask you to record just the species present in the outer 1 metre. As a tip here, I would say that as you lay your hedgerow plot, it is just worth checking that 1 metre width just from the centre of the hedge at intervals, just as I mentioned previously, as you're going along. Don't just place that 1 metre marker at both ends of the plot, but just double check as you're going along placing that plot, because the width of the hedge can of course vary along the length of your plot. Recording on your hedgerow plot, you need to be using the NPMS species list for the ground flora and the shrub species present, which you'll find in your species list. And that's whether you're using the wildflower or the indicator list. But if you are doing the inventory survey of all vascular plants, then you should be recording all the species that are rooted within the linear plot area. As with most linear plots, it's a good idea to search for and record species by starting at one end and basically working your way along the length of the plot. Almost in the same way actually as we suggest for square plots, where in that instance we suggest starting in a corner and working outwards. But with a linear plot, we can start at one end and work our way along. It is worth saying for hedgerows actually that in some instances they can be a bit tricky. We've got things or species like bramble that can be a bit tricky to navigate or not get caught up in. Some run along roads, in which case we always suggest surveying the other side of the hedge away from the road and traffic. Some also have additional fences running along them that can pose a bit of a barrier. So it is worth mentioning that. And that actually does bring me to an example of setting up a hedgerow plot that we have prepared here to watch. Indeed, this is an example of where there can be some of these little tricky additions, but will also hopefully help to illustrate the process of setting up a linear plot for this habitat. So I'm going to move on to the next slide and press play, and there's just a video for us to watch here.
Okay, so we've come out on site today looking for a linear plot. We're a little bit stuck for choices, but we have found a lovely hedgerow along the side of the field here that we're going to set up a linear plot. So we found the edge of the hedge here, and this could actually be quite a top tip really, because it can help us to look at where the centre of the hedge is, which of course we want to be recording from the centre to 1 metre out. So that can give us an idea of where the centre of our hedge is. So I have my trusty 1 metre ruler and I'm gauging where the centre of the hedge is. So now I've come round to the front of the hedge, I'm going to use my metre ruler and I'm going to be poking it through the fence and into the hedge to find the centre. And I can see here, while this fence may be a bit of a hindrance, actually it's quite handy today because it perfectly marks 1 metre out from the centre of the hedge. So I've hooked my measuring rope onto a peg, or if you could use a marker, perhaps something with a flag at the top so it's easily found amongst a bushy hedge. And I am placing that in line with the edge of the fence, which is marking our metre out. So we've used our rope here today to measure along 5 metres to pop in our first marker. It's not strictly necessary at this point because we are following the edge of the fence, but it may not be the case that it marks 1 metre out from the centre the whole way along. So it's really important to double check at intervals if we are still 1 metre out from the centre of the hedge. Yep, at this point it still is. So I'm going to be popping my next marker 5 metres along the edge. So we've reached the 5 metre point. Every 5 metres I put in a place marker just to double check that we are still 1 metre out from the centre of the hedge. We have been so far, so I'm going to do this one last time. So although the hedge has followed the fence the whole way along, I can see at my final point, by putting my metre rule into the centre of the hedge, that I can see that actually the hedge is wider here and it does extend further beyond the fence, and I can see that 1 metre out is actually inside of the fence. So I'm going to place my last peg and my rope inside the fence. April today while we're recording this, so it's not the best time. There's not going to be very much happening in the hedgerow for us to look at, but it is a really good opportunity to come and set up our plots, work out exactly where it's going to be. We can now record our coordinates, perhaps do a plot sketch, and really familiarise ourselves with the area, so that when we come back, when things are in bloom, we have a really good idea of where we're starting from, and we can set up our plot. So I've had a look on my compass, and I've located the southwest corner of my plot, and that's really the opportunity now to take a photograph of my plot, so that it can help me find it. But it's also a great record of any change in the plot. I can upload that with my data, and we can see how it changes over time. This is also the best opportunity now to make any note of any features to help me find my plot again. So we're very lucky here. I've got a great signpost just there that I can note down in my notes to help me find it. I know that I'm really near this gate, and that my plot starts right at the start of the hedge.
So one of the things that can be tricky when you've got a hedgerow is that you know that you need to record a metre into the centre of the hedgerow. So the last thing we want is for you to injure yourself through getting spiked by brambles or blackthorn or stung to bits with nettles. So sometimes what you need to do is just use a nice big stick to poke in the centre and have a bit of a poke around really, and see what vegetation you can see.
Okay, so as Sarah's just commented there on our in the chat box, there will also be popping some short videos onto our YouTube channel too, to help with guidance and setting up some plots. But then that leads us on to our road verges, which we're including in the presentation next, because although, as I've said, they're not actually habitat targeted by NPMS in their own right, but they do frequently contain NPMS habitats such as grasslands or heath, for example. They may not be wide enough to contain a 5 by 5 metre plot, but actually when road verges are found to correspond with these target semi-natural habitats, a 25 by 1 metre linear plot can be placed along the road line, as long as I say, they are in 1 metre in width. So we're also not looking for heavily managed verges, it's worth saying, that have perhaps been kept super tidy by the local council, for example, as we are looking at semi-natural habitats. But there may well still be some cutting, so don't forget here to note any management type that you can see has occurred. You can then conduct your survey, as suggested elsewhere, by starting at one end and working your way along when searching for species, which should be recorded, as I say, using the relevant species list. Of course, being careful not to actually stand in the plot and trample any species, because that will make it harder for yourself to find and record the next species that you're looking for. But it really does go without saying that please do not conduct your survey on right next to the road, or at least stand on the opposite side of the plot to the road, and just be careful. Be careful near roads and follow good road safety. We now move on to bodies of water, and for NPMS you can survey any bodies of water, of standing or running water, including rivers, streams, ponds, canals and ditches that have a shoreline long enough to accommodate a 25 metre long linear plot. As I've said, if a smaller linear plot is surveyed, for example, if the entire shoreline around a pond is less than 25 metres, this is okay, but you have to make sure that you have recorded the surveyed length, both on your recording forms and later when you're entering the data, whether on the app, of course, or on the website. So due to fluctuations in water level, the position of the water body plots can actually be quite difficult to define in some cases. So as a result, water bodies that we don't include actually, and therefore we don't survey, are those with widely fluctuating water levels. So basically these are not very good plot options. They're very hard to relocate or make sure that we're in the same place each time. So we do tend to exclude these, and they include things like fluctuating meres, perhaps temporary pools or ponds, man-made lakes or reservoirs, perhaps saline and brackish lakes or lagoons that may be affected by tides. So those are the ones that we don't include. But for more permanent water bodies, plots should very carefully be selected and recorded to ensure that they can be recorded and relocated accurately. So for running and standing freshwater plots, the plot should extend for 25 metres along the bank and then 1 metre out actually into the water. And that's from the maximum edge of the normal water level, as you can see with the diagram here, and the real example that I've just given. I've popped there on the slide. So the first thing that springs out here is that the body of water that your plot is bordering along is more than 1 metre wide. So if you're going and you've noticed on your habitat map that there looks to be a river or a stream, and you arrive on site and unfortunately it's less than 1 metre wide, I'm afraid that's not going to be able to be used as a plot. It does need to be a minimum of 1 metre wide. Not all plots will have a clear and very handy path running along the blank, as the example that I've popped on here has. So it is really important to ensure that you do have safe footing and access all along the length of your plot. Please don't put yourself at risk and do take extra care when surveying these habitats. These plots should be recorded without entering the water, so very much only survey from the bank. Please do not enter the water, however tempting it may be, to don those wellies or the waders and get a closer look. And it's also worth saying, please do be careful if you're leaning over to get a closer look. So for these plots, you're looking to record plants growing, as I say, within 1 metre of the shoreline within your plot. So that means the plots will encompass plants that are rooted on the margins of the water body. So these are the emergents, as well as also the plants growing in the open water. So we have the aquatic species, and that's either underwater, so the submerged aquatics, or on the water surface, so the floating aquatics. So as I say, record plants whether they are emerging, submerged, or floating. And of course, in relation to the specific species list for your habitat type. Just a reminder, I've popped there for myself to say that small bog pools should be recorded under blanket or raised bogs habitat type. It's also worth noting when we're thinking about what exactly to record, that plant fragments that have perhaps washed up on shorelines and so they're not rooted shouldn't be included. You should exclude those. Please don't record them. They've washed up from elsewhere, so to speak. So again, we just have a short video to watch now, seeing it actually out in the field. I'll press play on that.
So if you're wanting to set up your linear plot for a river or a stream or any kind of running water, the first thing that you really need to make sure is how wide is it? Is it wider than 1 metre? If we look here, we can see that this one is definitely wider than 1 metre. So we can set this one up as a linear plot. If, however, you were to find a tiny little stream or a lovely wet ditch in your square, if it's less than 1 metre, unfortunately, that's just not going to work as a linear plot for the NPMS. So I found quite a wide wet ditch here, which in most circumstances you probably wouldn't want to include. However, this one is quite wide, it's very wet, and it hasn't yet been completely inundated with vegetation. So we could probably set this one up as long as it goes the full length for the 25 metres. When you have decided that your river feature, your stream, is wide enough for you to set up a linear plot, then the next important thing to remember is exactly which bit that you're going to be recording the plant species in. And it's not always the bit that you think it's going to be. So the area that you want to be actually setting up your plot for recording is where the water level comes up to, and then 1 metre into the water. So that means that you're not necessarily going to be including all of the marginal vegetation, and it can be very dependent on what kind of vegetation you've got growing in the water itself. So if we look at this one as the example, you can see that the water level probably comes regularly up to this point here. Maybe on high water table levels it might overflow slightly, but generally the water level is up to about here. We've got lots of duckweed still sitting in this place here. So then we would want to use our 1 metre measuring stick to go across into there, which means we're going to be including this marginal vegetation here and anything else that we can see that's growing within that area. So we've come to another bit of waterway here, and it's a good example of where it can sometimes be difficult to know which bits to include in your survey. So again, we're looking for that regular edge of the water where the water line comes up to. So we've got some Juncus inflexus here, some hard rush, that is growing right out of the water, so that would be included. Whereas you can see more of the hard rush here grows up along this bank as proper sort of marginal vegetation, and you wouldn't want to be including that. Equally, I found some cuckoo flower in here, and there's things like some buttercup and stuff like that. None of that's within the recording line here. However, if any of it was growing right in the water line, like some watermint over there, then that could be included. One of the really most important things to remember, however, is safety first. Do not go near the water edge to check on a plant if you do not feel that it's safe, or that maybe you're on your own, because the last thing we want is a bit of a catastrophe over trying to identify a plant. So, you know, do bear in mind being safe first. So essentially, if you find a really nice pond that's got some nice vegetation in it, or any good sized pond really in your square, then that would be an ideal place to set up a linear plot around the perimeter of the pond.
An ideal situation would be that the exact perimeter of your pond is 25 metres. However, we understand that this is pretty unlikely. Therefore, when you look at the example pond 2, you can see that some of it equates to the 25 metres, and that would be your linear plot. However, if your pond is smaller and the perimeter is only, say, 15 metres or something, as long as you record the length, this can still form one of your linear plots.
So the same principle applies when you're looking at ponds. You'll want to do the perimeter edge of the pond as a linear plot. And again, you'll be looking at that natural water level and the 1 metre in towards the centre of the pond as your recording area.
So hopefully now you feel confident enough to be able to know where and how to set up your aquatic linear plot. Key points to take away. Remember, safety first. Do not enter the water to find out what a plant is. It really isn't worth it. For running and standing freshwater, plots should extend for 25 metres along the bank and 1 metre into the water area.
So that comes to the end of our water plot setter. Beautiful video there by Sarah. Thank you very much. Excellent timing with the heron. I very much enjoyed that. And I also just thought it was worth mentioning that if you do have freshwater plots within your square that you plan to survey, we do have a recording of a really great webinar with Sue Bell. Introducing freshwater habitats and the species within, identifying those species, I should say, on our dedicated YouTube channel. It's certainly worth a look. Oops. So now we're moving on to rock outcrops, cliff bases or screes. So if you have any of these habitat types within your square, it'd be absolutely fantastic if you're able to survey these. They tend to be slightly less represented within the NPMS database. So we're always super pleased when people do include these within their surveys. And this is really where our linear plots differ a little bit, actually, both in dimension and in placement of the plots. So for recording on rock outcrops and cliff bases, the long dimension of the linear plot should be placed actually along the base of the cliff or the outcrop. And so the shorter dimension, or the side of the plot, we could call it, actually extends vertically up the face of the outcrop or the cliff by 2 metres. so just above head height. So the dimensions of this vertical plot are therefore 2 meters high by 12.5 meters long. So you're still covering the same total surface area with your survey, but with shorter, wider plots. So please bearing with my entirely questionable diagram here of this chap standing at the base of a cliff. In this instance, we can see that the plot is laying 12.5 meters along the base, and it is extending 2 meters vertically. This allows the surveyor to carefully walk alongside the plot, scanning and recording the species seen. Most species should be identifiable at this distance actually, and so that avoids the need for you to take any unnecessary risks. We do ask that you only survey easily accessible areas, so at the base of the cliffs, and just really being sure of the structure and the integrity, I suppose, of the cliff and the rock surface. It's really important that you're doing this in an area where you're going to be safe. And really you're looking to include vegetation here growing on ledges and in the crevices, natural cliffs and crags of the outcrops. And it's also worth noting that you only record those species that are growing from within that plot. So, which I realise it does sound a little bit obvious now, but it can actually be quite tricky when you're actually there on the ground, where right at the base of, say, your cliff plot, there are species growing up from the ground in front of the cliff. So just be sure that those species that you're recording are actually growing from within the plot. And then moving on to screes. The same dimensions are used here for your linear plots in this habitat. So we're looking at 12.5 by 2 meter plots. But in this instance, the plot should be recorded as a single traverse. So noting species that are present within 2 meters either side of the walking route taken through the centre. So again, you can see on my diagram here, we have a person walking through the centre of a 12.5 by 2 meter plot. They are traversing that plot and looking 1 meter either side, and of course in front of them, not missing those species right in front of them. Care really does need to be taken with these plots, of course, owing to the loose stones. So in order to minimise the risk of injury and just to make sure that you're as safe as possible while you're conducting these surveys, these scree plots should follow contours. So you're following along the same altitude as you're working your way along the plot. You can use OS grid maps just to double check that you are actually running along the same contour. You're not trying to navigate going up and down slopes with potentially moving scree. As I say, only survey easily accessible areas that you feel comfortable accessing and moving around. For all fine habitat types within this group, please do not take any unnecessary risks. And if any doubt at all of your personal safety, we simply say not to attempt to record plots. It's not worth risking your health and safety. And again, I've just popped this little image here to remind myself to let you know that there's a really lovely and helpful guidance video for this habitat and the species ID within with Ben Avarice on our NPMS YouTube channel. And that really was the last of our habitat types on which we record linear plots. But it does lead us on nicely to that last main point we just wanted to reiterate, which is safety first. Of course, we have our general advice for surveyors setting out to record on their plots that you can see here. So thinking about your access and the landscape that you're working in, letting somebody know where you're going and when you expect to be back, being prepared for weather changes and considering taking perhaps first aid kit, your phone and any food or drink you might need. And of course, we always recommend that you recce the site and really get to know it. But there are, of course, some additional and quite specific considerations for some of the linear plots and the habitats that they lay within. So, for example, being mindful of any farm machinery or farm activity when you're surveying arable field margins. Also, road safety, as I've mentioned, is really important when surveying along road verges or perhaps even hedgerows that run alongside roads. As I've said, please do keep back from the road, ideally working on the opposite side of your plot. You may choose a road that's too busy, in fact, and when you first visit it, you think, do you know what, I don't feel comfortable here, this is a bit too busy. That's fine. Just don't choose that as a plot. go and have a little look somewhere else. We want you to feel comfortable and safe, and that's a very sensible decision to make. I've just mentioned cliff safety, so thinking about access, the possibility of loose or falling rocks. And lastly, when it comes to plots along waterways, we ask that you don't survey a large body of water alone. So please do take somebody with you. Ensure that you have safe footing and you're clear where the water edge is. I know in some examples, even the example in the video there with Sarah, it actually wasn't that clear to look. If you prop your foot down, if you're going to be standing on a hard surface, or if you're closer to the edge than you thought. So be sure where the water edge is. And of course, do not enter the water. As I've mentioned throughout, we do have a whole host of videos and past webinar recordings on our YouTube channel, including species ID actually within a number of these habitats that I've included today. So do take a look where they're applicable for your own square. And of course, again, something we always say is that we're always here and we are open to questions, whether by the support email address that you can see there, or over the phone is absolutely fine. So if you do have any questions or queries at any point, do get in touch. And of course, we have our regional mentors who are happy to help also. But we do also have a decent amount of time now actually as well. If there are any questions that you can think of that you'd like to raise, I believe Sarah is going to work through those now.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much, Rachel. That was really excellent. I think that was very clear and concise, and I'm sure everyone agreed. And as a result, we don't have many questions. However, there are a couple that I thought we would just cover quickly. So one of the questions we had was, what if there are none of the plants, for example, in your canal or your river that are on your indicator list? Because obviously, as we remember, we'll be looking under freshwater and then deciding whether we've got a river or a pond, etc. And then working off that list, unless of course you're recording at inventory level and then you're recording everything. But if there are no plants on that list, do not worry, that is still really important data for us, because that's a true absence. It's a real representation of the fact that there are none of those plants on your list present within your plot, which when you think about general plant recording that people do, it's always what they found. It's never what they haven't found. So really, really important that you still send in your data, even if it means it's a very quick trip on that particular plot. And yes, we know it can be boring, but I imagine your walk there, you might have seen some other nice things and made notes of those to put on iRecord or something else. Other question was about wet ditches. So whether you can include a wet ditch in as a plot. Generally, this is probably going to be a no. However, you saw on the video that I found a very, very large one. So it was much wider than the 1 meter minimum. And it was more sort of moving on to a pond area and coming off that. But if it's just a wet ditch at the base of a hedge, for example, then the ditch itself really isn't got, and we haven't got a habitat category for that in itself. So there's nothing really to compare it with. So it wouldn't be very useful in that sense. Equally, something like road verges. Again, we don't have that specific category for road verges, but what you can do is set up your road verge as a linear plot and then choose the appropriate habitat that fits for the road verge. So is it one of our lowland grassland categories, which is most of the time going to be the likelihood, because we don't have scrub and that sort of thing. So most of the time your road verges is going to be one of the grassland categories. It's also worth saying that flushes and ponds, we do love it if you could do a flush or a pond in your monad. So there's even if it doesn't necessarily fit these nice measuring angles, and flushes are obviously quite unusual in that they can be all sorts of shapes. So yeah, those are some things. We've also got a couple of other questions here. If I start my hedgerow linear plot on a grid line, there is a gap for a gate. So should I start it beyond the gate instead? That's a very good question. I think this is one of those sort of situations where it's very much an individual case. What would you do in that situation, Rachel, do you think?
I would start beyond the gate because I'd want the majority of my plot to be representative of the habitat. So that would be my personal, the aim for starting on the grid line is to help you relocate. And actually, that gate will also give you a really nice, handy thing to help you relocate it, you can pop on your notes, right, I've started it right at this gate, a bit like the example in the video that we had there. So my personal suggestion would be for that to be your starting point, as long as you do have that 25 meters beyond it.
Yeah, great answer, thank you. We've just got another quick question in here. Is it okay to do a linear plot that isn't one of those just covered? So I'd like to do one along a track between two steep slopes. So this one is kind of similar to the road verge one, so you could still do it as a linear plot, but I'm assuming that likely the habitat is some kind of grassland beneath it, so you would do it as that. You can, in some circumstances, do a linear plot as a woodland habitat, but again, you just have it as a linear plot. I've known people to do that. So yeah, I mean, your thoughts, Rachel, would you agree that that's still?
Yeah, and I think, you know, it's a really good point and something I totally should have said and will do in the future for the presentation, because as Sarah said, it is very similar to the road verge example, where road verges effectively they almost provide us with that linear. We have to do it as a linear because it's a long narrow plot, and what you're describing here along a track between two steep slopes is the same really. The main thing, as Sarah said, is that the habitat within that plot is one of the NPMS defined habitats, and that the extent of your plot is representative of that habitat. It's not sort of a mosaic of different habitats, for example. So as long as you say, if it's a grassland, for example, habitat, that's absolutely fine. So yes, is the short answer.
And especially, I know in certain circumstances where you've got a monad that is particularly lacking in semi-natural habitat, then you sometimes can be sort of slightly, you know, trying to find somewhere that's going to be suitable. So in that circumstance, yes, that's fine. We've got just a general question, which we get often asked a lot, which is, when should you do your spring survey? Now, again, we don't give a specific time of year to do it, like to the week or to the date. So it's really early summer, however you want to, or late spring, how you want to interpret that, and when is appropriate for yourself. Maybe, you know, when is appropriate for the majority of your habitats, but either way, you can go out there and do it now, or you could wait until June, or however you want. And next year, you don't have to do it at that exact same time, but it is good to do it within a roughly similar time, and then you'll get familiar with what is likely to appear at those stages as well.
Yeah, so something that I always say is we should really not call them our first survey and our second survey, because quite often, you know, people may be joining the scheme in the summer, for example, so they're doing their later summer survey as their first survey. But as Sarah said, the main thing is that we have, when you record your plot and you then record the data up by the app or on the website, that you put the date for your survey. That's the main thing. So when the data all goes in for the analysis, they're not divided into two for your spring survey and your summer survey. They're very much analysed based on the actual dates that those were conducted. So you're not set in stone. It doesn't need to be the exact same time each year, but a lot within that range, as Sarah described.
It's also worth noting, and some people are never sure of this, if you are sort of new to the scheme, and it's all feeling a little bit daunting at this point, and you're thinking, oh crumbs, you know, we're getting to the end of May and I haven't sorted anything out, then don't worry. Maybe just do the one survey this year, or maybe just get used to your square and get those plots set up this year. That is all fine as well. There's no pressure and no rush if you want to take your time in getting familiar with your square. The most important thing is that you're happy with your square and your plots, so that you can plan to do them as long as you can, rather than a sort of dip in and dip out. That's the more important thing. It's feeling comfortable with your choices, really.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So that's the thing, is I think it's always worth spending that time just actually enjoying the setup process as well, and enjoying getting to know your square and your different plots, and maybe thinking, oh, do you know what, I thought I was going to put it there, but actually I don't think that is going to be suitable. I'm not sure that is suitable. Maybe there's a better option there. That's far better to do, and spend that time being really comfortable and happy with your choices, rather than rushing to get there for the first round of surveys, definitely. And you're more likely to carry on and enjoy doing it, you know, when you do come to complete your surveys. And we're really aware, I know Sarah will say she agrees with this, we're really aware that this is almost the trickiest part, actually, is getting all those plots set up and making sure that you're familiar with methodology and how to do these things. And actually, when it comes to doing the surveys, that's almost the easier bit, dare I say it. So yeah, do take the time.
Yeah, totally.
Looks like that's all the questions that have come in, Rachel. So if we're all happy, then yeah.
Yeah, that's and what I would say is, if you're anything like me, I do this every time I do anything like this. I think I haven't got a question, and 10 minutes later I'll be making a cup of tea and go, oh, I forgot to ask that, or I should have asked that. As I've got there on the slide there, you can see our email address and we've got a phone number. That's our job. There's no question that's silly. It's never wasting a time. Do get in touch with any questions that you think of. Yes. And I guess, yeah, as Sarah said, that all that remains to be said is thank you. Thank you very much for watching. I hope it was helpful. We will be popping this up on YouTube as well, should you like to watch it again later. And as I say, there's lots of other survey guidance videos and species ID guidance videos on there.
Brilliant.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody.
All right, bye.
Have a good rest of your day. Bye-bye.